Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining for this special event. Today, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health, and we mark the many accomplishments and remaining challenges of women's health research. I'm often asked, what is the story behind ORWH? Even on an elevator where 20-second answers are de rigueur, I can't help wanting to reply, how many floors are you going? There's simply so much to our story. Its history is rich and meaningful. Its creation a combination of organic, that is in response to scientific knowledge, and community-driven in response to an era's reaction to inequities in society. ORWH is organic in another way, how it responds and adjusts to the emergence of new knowledge and diseases and changes in society. In this slide, I'm going to start our chapter, talking about the founding of ORWH, and the seeds for the office were planted many years ago. It started with an awakening. The civil rights and women's rights movements of the 1960s, with their concerns about social justice and equality, created fertile ground for the rise of another movement, the women's health movement. Women's and minority advocacy groups drew attention to the inequities in research and healthcare. In the early 1970s, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective published the profoundly influential book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. Healthcare activist Billy Avery established what later became the Black Women's Health Imperative. It drew attention to the ways the healthcare system marginalized African-American women. A series of drug recalls around the same time revealed that many drugs pose greater risks in women than men. Moreover, it became evident that nearly all of the medicines on the market were tested only in men. And that got Congress's attention. Members of the Congressional Caucus for Women's Health Issues weighed in particular, Senator Barbara Mikulski and Representatives Connie Morell, Olympia Snowe, and Pat Schroeder. They pushed for increasing inclusion of women as research participants, as well as expanding research on diseases and conditions affecting women. Also influential were patient advocacy organizations, research institutions, even medical societies and women's health groups. Finally, the scientific community took note of the gaps in medical research. More and more biomedical research was finding sex differences in disease manifestation and responses to treatment. The science could no longer be ignored, nor could the inequities in research and healthcare. And NIH responded, led principally by 4 forward-thinking leaders. Dr. Edward Brandt, then Assistant Secretary of Health, established the Public Health Service Task Force on Women's Health Issues. For its chair, he appointed Dr. Ruth L. Kirstein. Under her leadership, the task force advocated greater inclusion of women in NIH-funded clinical research. It also recommended more biomedical and biobehavioral research be done on conditions and diseases unique to or more prevalent in women. In 1990, in response to growing concerns about underrepresentation of women in clinical studies on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, NIH established ORWH and appointed Dr. Kirstein acting director. Very supportive of Dr. Kirstein's leadership over the following year was newly appointed Director of NIH, Dr. Bernadine Healy, who was a strong advocate for women's health research. Dr. Healy was the first and to date only woman to hold the position. And a year later, Dr. Vivian Pinn, then chair of pathology at Howard University College of Medicine, became the first full-time director of the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health, a position she would hold until she retired in 2011. Let me take a moment and acknowledge the contributions of everyone who played a role in ORWH's founding, from these visionary leaders at NIH to policymakers, advocates, and other women and men who pressed for an increase in women's health research. Thank you. This next chapter of my presentation will review just a handful of major achievements in women's health of the last 30 years. Each of these examples happens to relate to a disease or condition that is specific to women. First, the Women's Health Initiative, a monumental undertaking launched in 1993 by Dr. Bernadine Healy with funding from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. It was and is one of the largest disease prevention and clinical studies ever conducted on women's health. It's still contributing knowledge about cardiovascular disease and aging. The Women's Health Initiative, or WHI, found that menopausal hormone therapy did not prevent heart disease in postmenopausal women as once thought. The WHI demonstrated that the use of estrogen plus progestin hormone therapy after menopause increased the risk for heart disease, stroke, blood clots, dementia, and breast cancer. And an in-depth analysis for one of the WHI postmenopausal hormone therapy trials has found that the investment in WHI resulted in a return of $140 in net income value for each dollar invested in the trial. I think you'll be hearing more about maximizing ROI in the future. Around the same time, in 1994, NIH led the discovery of the first gene shown to be responsible for some inherited breast and ovarian cancers. Discoveries in breast cancer genetics, the WHI results, and other discoveries have led to important improvements in screening, genetic testing, risk assessment models, and clinical management decisions. They have helped us make continuous progress on reducing death rates due to breast cancer over the past 3 decades. In 1992, the age-adjusted death rate due to breast cancer in U.S. women had fallen from nearly 32 deaths per 100,000 women to about 20 per 100,000. Putting this decline into context, take a look at the chart on the right. It demonstrates just how dramatic a decline that is. For more than half a century, death rates were holding relatively steady at about 30 to 35 deaths per 100,000. One of the most extraordinary discoveries of the past 30 years is the human papillomavirus vaccine. We have a vaccine against cancer. The HPV vaccination with booster shots developed by NIH offers durable protection against the types of HPV, human papillomavirus, that cause almost all cervical cancer. More exciting news, with cost and other barriers impeding many from getting booster shots, an NCI-funded and ORWH-supported study is testing a single-dose vaccine. Interim results indicate long-lasting protection. This vaccine also benefits men. More than 1/3 of HPV-associated cancers are diagnosed in males, and more than half of oropharyngeal cancers are type 16. This next advance is not only important scientifically, it's pretty darn cool. In 2012, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the Food and Drug Administration began work on developing 3D chips with living cells and tissues. Its goal? To develop a device that could more accurately model human organs. And the why? It is to address the high rate of failure of candidate medications due to toxicity or lack of efficacy when they reach human trials. Evitar was developed by the NCATS team, and it's a miniaturized representation of the female reproductive tract and liver on an interconnected platform. Besides testing candidate medications, Evitar is being used to model polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. It could pave the way toward improved reproductive health testing for conditions like infertility, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, and female cancers. These are all very important areas. My final example involves a recent advance in a clinical application. Postpartum depression is a mood disorder that affects some women after childbirth. Until recently, there was no treatment specifically approved for postpartum depression. Many years of NIH-funded research led to the development of this breakthrough drug. with FDA approval of brexanolone in 2019, women from postpartum depression for the first time ever had effective relief. These are just 4 examples over the past 30 years. They represent the brilliance, dedication, and inspiration of many scientists, women and men behind them. I would like to thank the investigators who conceptualized these advances, who then validated, tested, and ultimately executed on their designs. We have so much for which to be thankful to them. It's not just through research that ORWH advances the health of women. I'm proud to say that ORWH has been a leader in implementing innovative policies that have made a real difference. The first is inclusion, which truly is in ORWH's DNA. For some background. For many years, researchers typically did not include women in clinical trials, or for that matter, female animals in preclinical research. There were a number of reasons, none of them good. Researchers believed there were no significant differences between males and females other than their reproductive functions. Women, especially pregnant women, were also considered a vulnerable population that needed to be protected, and there are valid concerns there. And another reason was the concern that women's variable hormonal status could not be adequately controlled for. Unfortunately, as a result, medications that were prescribed to women were routinely tested in men. In other words, unisex research. Unisex works in fashion sometimes and in eyeglasses, but not so well in biomedical research. The omission of women from studies created critical gaps in scientific knowledge about conditions that affect women more frequently than men or differently. It compromised our fundamental understanding of female biology. So beginning in the 1980s, NIH and Congress established, formalized, and expanded inclusion policies to address women and racial and ethnic minority groups. More recently, the 21st Century Cures Act expanded inclusion to include individuals of all ages. It also cleared the path to including pregnant and lactating women. 2 other policy developments are helping to advance inclusion. The Cures Act also created an important mandate. It requires NIH-defined applicable phase 3 clinical trials to report their results disaggregated by sex, gender, race, and ethnicity into clinicaltrials.gov. Finally, inclusion data for specific disease groups are now reported by sex, gender, race, and ethnicity in the NIH Research, Condition, and Diseases Categorization Report. Of course, the $64,000 question is, did NIH inclusion policy work? For the most part, yes. Today, about half of NIH-supported clinical trial and clinical research participants are women. Moreover, women are less likely to receive beneficial treatments than men with cardiovascular disease. Women who present with heart attack symptoms are less likely than men to receive fibrinolytic drugs, stents, and related therapies. Consistent with the lingering view that obstructive coronary artery disease is primarily a man's disease, women with this condition are less likely to receive several of the indicated medical treatments such as coronary revascularization, statins, beta blockers, aspirin, and even therapeutic lifestyle coaching. The fact is that epidemiology, symptoms, pathophysiology, and outcomes of heart disease differ between the sexes. Women have been underrepresented in these areas of research, often due to poorly justified inclusion or exclusion criteria, including arbitrary participant age limits. And women who are enrolled often do not accurately represent the women in the general population with the cardiovascular conditions. So successful research and treatment of diseases requires inclusion of individuals representing the populations with the highest disease burden. This must include equitable participation of both sexes and all races and ethnicities. And sex and gender considerations must be threaded throughout the entire research continuum. This requires balanced mixed sex research designs, stratification of samples by sex, analysis of data by sex, and sex-specific reporting of results in both preclinical, translational, and clinical research. plus the preclinical research where the building blocks of science are created, continues to over-rely on male animals. Finally, there's been minimal progress in one area where it really counts: the disaggregation, analysis, and reporting of data by sex in publications. On this score, there's so much work to be done, but more on that later. The second great innovation of the past 30 years has been the transformation of the meaning of women's health. For decades, women's health meant maternal and reproductive health almost exclusively. Bikini medicine, they used to call it. With the rise of the women's health movement, the focus began to shift or broaden. Today, the health of women encompasses the whole woman from head to toe over the life course. On a more fundamental level, the approach to the health of women took on a multidimensional aspect. Yes, it includes biology, but it also includes all diseases and conditions that affect women. It recognizes that diseases, manifestations, diagnosis, and treatment might differ for women, but it also includes external factors. Due to the important research done by NIH and others, we now know that the health of women is affected by many factors that interact, not just the individual's biology or genetics, but her environment, her community, and the larger society she lives in. In fact, we are increasingly discovering how biological internal factors, those at the bottom of this graphic, intersect with the social and contextual aspects found at the top of the graphic. Moreover, they affect a host of areas such as health status, disease presentation and treatment response, as well as the effects of the diseases and conditions on quality of life. The third innovative policy may end up being the most transformational. In the last 30 years, research on women's health has come a long way. Women now make up half of the participants of NIH-funded studies, and we're making progress in the use of female animals in preclinical research. But the inclusion of women in clinical studies and the use of female animals in preclinical research are just the initial steps. We now know sex affects cell physiology, metabolism, and many other fundamental biological functions, the symptoms of disease, and medication side effects. But unless biomedical research accounts for sex at every level, from the laboratory to the clinic, you could say that we are missing at least half of the story. NIH was also concerned about the lack of reproducibility reported. So we heightened our focus on the need for rigor and reproducibility and transparency, which included the next big step in women's health. 5 years ago, we issued a landmark policy that was part of a global movement to integrate the study of sex into the research process. It states, NIH expects that sex as a biological variable will be factored into research designs, analyses, and reporting in vertebrate animal and human studies, unless a strong justification for single-sex study exists. Accounting for sex as a biological variable, or SABV, begins with the development of the research question and then the study design. It also includes data collection and analysis of results, as well as reporting findings. It's multifaceted, with each facet as important as the other. So why does it matter? Considering SABV in preclinical research and human trials, stratifying the data by sex and reporting results will build a more complete knowledge base, which has important benefits, ranging from improving the design of clinical research and trials, informing sex and gender aware diagnoses and treatment, enabling individualized approaches for women and men, and fostering a system-based understanding of sex and gender influences in health and disease. And ORWH is taking a leading role in implementing the NIH SABV policy across the enterprise. One of the principal ways is through resources. We at ORWH are very pleased with 3 recent additions to our interprofessional education courses, all online and free. I'll briefly mention 2 of them. First is our Bench to Bedside, Integrating Sex and Gender to Improve Human Health online course. Developed in partnership with the FDA's Office of Women's Health, this 6-module course gives users a thorough and up-to-date understanding of sex and gender influences on health and disease. To date, Bench to Bedside has been well received. From September 1st to December 1st, 2020, we had over 750 unique viewers to the ORWH's courses webpage. The second course is titled Sex as a Biological Variable Primer. It was developed by ORWH with funding support for the National Institute of General Medical Sciences and a cadre of subject matter experts. Its 4 independent, interactive modules are designed to help the biomedical research community, including researchers, NIH grant applicants, and peer reviewers, account for and appropriately integrate SABV across the full spectrum of biomedical sciences. As I said earlier, women's health research is an NIH-wide endeavor. The principal way ORWH supports and funds research is through our signature programs. Each involves research collaborations with the institute, centers, and offices across NIH. There's BIRCH, the Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health Programs, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year. This mentored career development program connects junior faculty, known as BIRCH scholars, to senior faculty who shared interest in women's health and sex differences research. Since 2000, 88 grants to 44 institutions supporting more than 700 junior faculty have been awarded. Second is SCORE, or the Specialized Centers of Research Excellence on Sex Differences program. It's NIH's only disease-agnostic center-level sex differences grant program. And then our Sex and Gender Administrative Supplement program, which allows investigators to expand sex and gender data, adding to their existing efforts. And finally, NIH's first ever R01, focused on the intersection of sex and gender influences on health and disease, is now entering year 2. One of the greatest health challenges facing the United States, apart from the coronavirus pandemic, is the state of maternal health. It's abysmal. Our nation's maternal mortality rate, which continues to climb, is the highest among world's high-income countries, whose rates are declining. Tragically, up to 60% of these deaths are preventable. In maternal health, as in other areas of research, significant disparities exist among populations of women. For example, maternal mortality rates are 3 times higher for Black women than white women. The situation regarding severe maternal morbidity is equally dire. It affects over 50,000 women annually in the United States at a rate that has nearly doubled during the past decade. Incidence of severe maternal morbidity among Black women is especially serious. Compared to white women, the rate for SMM is 166% higher for Black women. NIH's response to maternal health disparities has been robust. Here are just a few examples. The NIH Maternal Mortality Task Force has issued an initiative called Improve, funding $7 million in FY20. The Idea States program, ORWH partnered with NIGMS to expand women's health research in Idea States. The NIMHD-led R01 focused on maternal health disparities. And then ORWH's own U3 program, understudied, underreported, and underrepresented populations of women, provides support for maternal health relevant topics as listed here. I would be remiss not to address NIH's response to COVID-19. We recently released the NIH-wide strategic plan for COVID-19 research. It provides a much-needed framework for accelerating the development of therapies, vaccines, and diagnostics. I call your attention to Priority 5, which commits NIH to addressing the needs of health disparity and vulnerable populations. Specifically understanding and addressing COVID-19 as it relates to these populations, and understanding and addressing COVID-19 maternal health and pregnancy outcomes. This is my last chapter of my presentation, and it focuses on careers. Advancing women in biomedical careers was one of ORWH's original charges from the NIH and then later from Congress. This work began in earnest right away with the creation of the reentry supplements in 1992. Perhaps one of the most seminal moments in the history of ORWH was the release in 2008 of a specific funding opportunity announcement the causal factors and interventions for women in biomedical and bioengineering research, RFA. Never before had NIH investigated why women were neither entering nor advancing in STEM fields. It was a bold step, but a natural one for NIH to assemble evidence of what barriers exist and what interventions work. As a result of this RFA, the volume of evidence expanded significantly, the effect of which was to accelerate change in the workplace and academia. More recently, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report on promising practices took the discussion to another level. If we know what works, then why aren't institutions adopting these best evidence-based practices? What are the institutional barriers? And what needs to be done to advance specific groups like women of color? The last 3 decades, we've seen dramatic and exciting gains in women's entry into scientific fields of study. As you can see here, about half of all medical degree and life sciences Ph.D. recipients in STEM fields are women. At the same time, there's much more work that needs to be done. Women continue to face persistent and deep-rooted barriers to their advancement. In 2020, the NIH Working Group on Biomedical Careers and the ORWH undertook several major initiatives, 2 of which address critical junctures in women scientists' careers. The overarching goal of the continuity supplements is to support the transition and retention of investigators to minimize departures from biomedical research at these critical junctures. One being the transition from a mentored career development, or K award, to an independent research project award, and the other being the transition from a first independent research project award to sustained funding in the form of a first renewal or a second independent research award. These programs are open to women and men, but because eligibility is tied to critical life events during the project period, events such as childbirth, adoption, and primary caregiving responsibilities of an ailing spouse, child, partner, or member of the immediate family, these are expected to improve the situation for women scientists. The last major initiative is the Challenge Prize, called the NIH Prize for Enhancing Faculty Gender Diversity in Biomedical and Behavioral Science. Its goal is to recognize and disseminate transformative institutional approaches that successfully address faculty diversity and equity issues in biomedical and behavioral science departments. The prize is noteworthy because of how it aligns with previous work in this done both in and outside of NIH. It's one of 4 concepts developed out of the Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers. It aligns with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Promising Practices report and the NIH Advisory Committee to the Director Working Group on Changing the Culture to End Sexual Harassment recommendations, as well as other NIH policy changes and programs. What exactly are the kinds of interventions the prize has in mind? They could include interventions that address barriers to career advancement, enhance pathways to leadership, establish equitable recruitment practices, change workplace culture, or implement mentoring structures, work-life integration programs, and career flexibility options. The coronavirus pandemic has wreaked havoc on nearly every sector of society and the economy. Its impact has affected women in STEM fields. Pandemic-related household and caregiving responsibilities are interrupting research and reducing publishing, which can impede advancement. The impact on early career investigators is especially devastating. Women's departure and slowed advancement will affect the direction of research for many years. Its impact is likely to change the face and work of biomedical research for years to come. So many hard-fought gains are now at risk, especially among women in academia and STEM fields. While many institutions have begun to address the unique challenges that women scientists face, more institutions must step up to the plate. Before I finish, I would like to extend a special thank you to the unsung heroines of biomedical research, the women volunteers who participate in clinical trials. Usually at some expense and inconvenience, often at great risk to their health, these tens of thousands of women have been indispensable to the work of biomedical researchers. Without them, our knowledge base would be a fraction of what it is today. Thank you. The current pandemic underscores the critical role of inclusion of women of all backgrounds in clinical studies. With women being half of the population and playing pivotal roles in society, these two questions are just not academic ones. How does COVID manifest itself in women, and how do women respond to therapies? The women who participate in COVID-19 clinical trials will help us answer those questions. And lastly, I invite you to connect with ORWH online and through its many communications channels. Each issue of our quarterly publication, Women's Health in Focus at NIH, covers a core area of women's health research, from inclusion in the recent issue to SABV to women in biomedical careers, or specific conditions that affect women. Our monthly Pulse email keeps you up to date on breaking developments in research at ORWH and NIH's programs. And of course, we're on social media. Please join us for rich conversations about women's health topics. Since 1990, the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health has been at the forefront of advancing biomedical research to improve the health of women. Because of ORWH's leadership across NIH and the entire biomedical research enterprise, and because of its support of biomedical research, women today are living longer, healthier lives. More work, though, needs to be done. For ORWH, the path forward holds great promise. We believe that the more we study sex and gender, the better the science. And the better the science, the better the health of everyone. Thank you. 3 minutes is nowhere near enough time to adequately cover all the contributions that our next speaker has made to improving the health of women. From a scientific perspective, Dr. Frances Collin, the director of the National Institutes of Health, is a giant among the giants of biomedical research. After getting his Ph.D. in physical chemistry at Yale University and his medical degree at the University of North Carolina, Dr. Collins made genetics his area of concentration. He's noted for his groundbreaking discoveries of disease-causing genetic mutations and later his leadership of the Human Genome Project, which came to a spectacular conclusion in 2003 with the completion of the finished sequence of the human genome. For these achievements and a lifetime of contributions to biomedical research, Dr. Collins was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2007 and received the National Medal of Science in 2009. This year, he was elected as a foreign member of the Royal Society. And in 2020, he was also named the 50th winner of the Templeton Prize, which celebrates scientific and spiritual curiosity. Under his leadership of NIH, there has been a tremendous growth in the research of women's health, from maternal health and breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and mental health, and everything in between, from head to toe and across the life course. NIH has funded research that has produced monumental work that has contributed mightily to our understanding of the diseases and conditions that affect women. Dr. Collins has also been a champion of policies that have helped advance the health of women. He's been a strong supporter of increasing women's participation in clinical trials, as well as the participation of other underrepresented populations. Dr. Collins has been a leader in examining and improving the ways we conduct science. I had the great privilege of collaborating with Dr. Collins on the development of the NIH policy on sex as a biological variable, or what we call SABV. I look forward to our continued work on implementing SABV across NIH and throughout the NIH community. Likewise, advance on, or should I say against, males will lead to more opportunities for women scientists to shine, contribute, and be recognized. Clear also has been his commitment to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women and people of color in biomedical research careers. These are just a few examples of his commitment to a diverse scientific workforce as a necessary means to producing excellent science. finally, on a personal level, throughout my tenure as ORWH Director, Dr. Collins has been a mentor, a visionary colleague, and an ally. We at ORWH have been so fortunate to have an NIH Director with such commitment to achieving ORWH's vision, a vision in which sex and gender influences are integrated throughout the biomedical research enterprise. Every woman receives evidence-based disease prevention and treatment tailored to her own needs, circumstances, and goals, and all women in science careers reach their full potential. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the 16th Director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Frances S. Collin.
Well, thanks, Dr. Clayton. And thanks to everybody who has joined today to celebrate 30 years of the National Institutes of Health and its Office of Research on Women's Health. Anniversaries are a cause to celebrate, also to reflect, to take stock as we look forward. And of course, COVID-19 has managed to interrupt a lot of these kinds of celebrations, but it will not prevent us today from having this virtual moment to see what has been accomplished, what still lies ahead, and to collectively celebrate these 3 decades of progress. A word about the history. ORWH was formed in response to a growing outcry. It could be called call for social justice. In that instance, the fact that women were underrepresented in clinical research, and therefore conclusions were being drawn based largely on research on men that may or may not have been appropriate for half the population. In the 1970s, the 1980s, citizens, scientists, clinicians, policymakers coming to the same conclusion and beginning to get some traction that the health of women had been shortchanged and something had to be done. And a wise step forward was the formation of our own Office of Research on Women's Health. In the early 1990s, Dr. Bernadine Healy, who, by the way, recruited me to NIH to run the Genome Project, the first woman director of NIH, she saw this as both an opportunity and a responsibility and a mandate. And in 1993, she launched the Women's Health Initiative, one of the largest disease prevention and clinical studies ever conducted on women's health. This was challenging to put together something at this scale, but the results have been stunning. They concluded, in fact, that hormone treatments for women should be based on research that includes women, not merely clinical assumptions. And the results have led to 126,000 fewer cases of breast cancer, 76,000 fewer cases of cardiovascular disease because of what we learned about hormone treatments and when they're safe and when they're not. So think of all the lives saved by that initiative. And putting on my economic hat for a minute, also consider the economic benefits. The Women's Health Initiative has helped save approximately $35 billion in direct medical costs in the US. So if you want to do this return on investment calculation for NIH investment in research, that's about 140 to 1 for the money that was spent on this research effort. Pretty darn good investment, and showing the way to how these kinds of initiatives focusing on sex differences are not just a nice thing to do, they are essential. So ORWH today continues to focus on affecting transformational change. ORWH is a leading voice for sex differences research and helping train the next generation of researchers to include that kind of insight in whatever they do. And also to enact research-changing policy innovations. Janine Clayton and I focused on this issue, particularly on the lack of rigor and reproducibility in NIH research. And a major part of that turned out to be the failure to consider sex as a biological variable in many animal model experiments. And yet preclinical research relies on that kind of experiment in order to decide how to take things forward into human application. And if that had not considered sex differences, then you were not well prepared for making that leap into human applications. So we worked hard on that and put forward a policy which has now been embraced, adopted, enforced even by NIH, that is not just an option, it is absolutely essential in preclinical studies of animals that there be an understanding of sex differences, which means recording that and making sure males and females are included, and that it is possible to be able to see if there's a significant difference, that doesn't just get all swept together in some kind of average finding. So when you start looking for sex influences, you're more likely to find them, and people have now been doing so right and left. A recent study that really underlines the biology here relates to the program called Gtex that is funded by the Common Fund. Gtex aims to look at gene expression across dozens of tissues in hundreds of rapid autopsies in order to discern what is the pattern of gene expression in the human body. And when you look at the differences between men and women, they found more than 13,000 genes. That's a pretty significant fraction of the total, a little over half, that are expressed differently between the sexes. That clearly affects some 50 bodily traits and functions. So you simply can't do human research, even if you think you're just looking at something as basic as gene expression, without considering sex differences. It's a fundamental part of how biology works. I guess we sort of knew that, but yet sometimes it got pushed aside in an effort to try to carry out experiments that didn't really have that kind of consideration about sex differences. ORWH is determined to make sure that people don't make that mistake. On top of the way in which ORWH has played its role in making sure that the science pays attention to sex differences, they've also been very important in advancing women to leadership roles in the sciences and throughout the biomedical research workforce. And I've been fortunate to be an ally in this effort in my 11 years as NIH Director, working with the NIH Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers, which I co-chair with Janine, coming up with a wide variety of approaches to try to understand why we still seem to have difficulties with appropriate promotion, retention, and advancement of women to senior positions, even though we're doing better in terms of women receiving doctoral degrees in the life sciences. For my part, I've tried to do what I can to emphasize the importance of women leaders in other ways. I announced a year and a half ago, and got a lot more attention than I expected, that I would no longer take part in symposia or meeting panels that were composed entirely of men, so-called manels, which unfortunately often seemed to be the case when people simply weren't thinking about the fact that there's a great deal of talent and diversity, and yet oftentimes that talent was not well represented in those gatherings. And so-called manels and hymposia became too often the norm. Well, I've stuck to that. I don't think I've made any mistakes in the last year and a half. And it's been really interesting because when I get sent an invitation, the first question is, okay, what is the diversity in your symposium or your panel of participation? And if the answer doesn't look as if they got it about the essential nature of diversity, both of women and of underrepresented groups, then they get a message back that says, Dr. Collins thinks your meeting sounds interesting, but he will not be able to attend unless you pay more attention to this issue. And you know, most of the reactions at that point are pretty interesting. It's not that they say, oh, you're just like one of those people are going to make us do something we don't want to do. No, they go, you know, you're right. I guess we didn't think about this. So maybe by this little triggering of the thought process, something can happen. I would encourage all of you who are involved in meetings and symposia to take that same approach. And the differences can be significant. And the way in which this influences the richness of our scientific conversation should not be understated. And of course, when it comes to recruiting leaders, I also have had a chance as NIH Director to recruit new institute directors. Since we have 27 institutes and centers, and the average time for somebody to stay on board is in the neighborhood of a decade. So over this time, there have been turnovers, and I'm very happy to tell you that now we have no less than 10 of our 27 institutes and centers that are women, by far the largest number in our history, and I'd love to see it go even a little higher. So we're trying to do everything we can to encourage women's participation in clinical research, the importance of diversity. One final thing I would just say, the All of Us program, which is enrolling 1 million Americans in the most ambitious long-term cohort study on health and illness, has as one of its major defining points attention to diversity. So it will be both sex balanced, roughly 50-50, and also will have reached out and has reached out in the first 380,000 participants to enroll participants from racial and ethnic groups that are traditionally underrepresented, as well as people from rural communities, as well as people who are of lower socioeconomic status and lower educational level. The groups that often don't get included, we want that to be a signature aspect of All of Us. And the team that is doing that has succeeded that in ways that I think are really quite impressive. So here we are in ORWH's 30th year, a year that has been marked, of course, by something else called COVID-19, which has forced a lot of us to carry out our mission in fashions that we hadn't quite anticipated. Yes, I'm speaking to you from my home office in Chevy Chase, where I've kind of been holed up since March trying to run NIH. But people have been remarkably willing to drop everything and figure out how to make that work. And boy, if I had any doubts about the dedication of the biomedical research community to rise to the occasion, to rise to a challenge, to stick to their noble enterprise of trying to figure out a way to make the world a better place. They have all done that this year in remarkable partnerships, collaborations, just to make every possible scientific advance happen as quickly as it possibly could. And here we are now in a circumstance where vaccines are going to be in the arms of high-risk people even before the end of 2020, something that one could not have imagined a few years ago, because this generally would be a 10-year project, and instead it's been done in less than a year. That should give us enthusiastic hope and optimism that we can do other things faster than anybody thought. And there are some lessons here that we will need to incorporate into how NIH does things. But most of all, I think we want to do things in the fashion that is right and good. And that means paying attention to sex differences, doing the best possible rigorous research to help all of those folks who are out there waiting for us to come up with answers to medical conditions that haven't yet really been sorted out. ORWH is a critical part of that. And so finally, I just want to say thank you to all of you who've been part of this adventure. The adventure will continue. We're marking this milestone and then preparing for what's next. We have a lot of potentially exciting science to do going forward to improve the health of women. That is what I am dedicated to, and I know you are as well. So thank you, and 30 years, wow, celebrate. I'm celebrating with you, although I wish I could be there in person to do it. Maybe next year, at the 31st, we'll have a better chance for that. Many thanks.
Since 1990, the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health has been dedicated specifically to promoting women's health research. The office has served as the focal point at NIH for research relevant to the health of women and has promoted and supported women's health research in the greater biomedical community as well. One of the most important developments of the past 30 years has been the transformation of the term women's health from a narrow focus on maternal and reproductive health to a broader, holistic, and multidimensional concept involving the health of women from head to toe and across their lifespans. ORWH is addressing the complex intersection of factors that affect women's health, from biological variables to gender roles, policies, and social determinants of health. This transformation evolved over many years. During the 1960s, the civil and women's rights movements gave rise to the women's health movement, which drew attention to inequities in research and healthcare. Later, a series of drug recalls revealed that many drugs posed greater health risks to women than to men. Moreover, nearly all medications were tested only in men. The scientific community took note and responded, led by forward-thinking leaders such as Bernadine Healy, Ruth Kirstein, Vivian Pinn, and later ORWH's current director, Janine Clayton, and NIH Director Francis Collins. Congress, too, pressed for change. Also influential were patient advocacy organizations, research institutions, medical societies, and women's health groups. In the late 1980s and 90s, NIH adopted inclusion policies that accelerated the movement toward a multidimensional approach to women's health. A few years later, the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993 required the inclusion of women and minorities in NIH-funded clinical research. Today, about half of participants in NIH clinical trials are women. More recently, the 21st Century Cures Act required NIH to revise its policy on the inclusion of children in clinical research, expanding the policy to include individuals of all ages. But inclusion didn't go far enough. For women to receive optimal clinical care, clinicians need to understand how sex and gender affect disease manifestation, diagnosis, and treatment. In 2016, the NIH's landmark Sex as a Biological Variable policy, the development of which was led by ORWH, further advanced women's health by helping to ensure that the potential influences of sex on health and disease are considered early and throughout the research process. This work also helps advance women's health toward a holistic, multidimensional framework. Through the years, ORWH's signature research programs have added to the body of knowledge that is informing this approach to women's health. Among these are the Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health, or BIRCH program, a trans-NIH collaborative effort launched in 2000 that connects junior faculty to senior faculty with shared interest in women's health and sex differences research. The Specialized Centers of Research Excellence on Sex Differences, or SCORE program, which translates scientific knowledge about how diseases affect women and men differently into new treatments that improve clinical care. The U3 Program, NIH's only program focused on researching health disparities among populations of women that have been understudied, underrepresented, and underreported in biomedical research. NIH's first research project grant that focuses on sex and gender in health and disease. And ORWH-funded research and programs that are addressing pressing issues women currently face, such as maternal morbidity and mortality and opioid use disorder. Supporting the advancement of women in biomedical careers has been a key aspect of ORWH's mission. The office has also played a vital role in supporting a diverse biomedical research workforce, including both women and men, that addresses the health of women. In 2007, NIH Director Elias Zerhouni established the Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers. Its landmark Causal Factors and Interventions initiative produced research that has expanded opportunities and reduced barriers for women in biomedical research. This diversity has produced better science. Studies show that women researchers are more likely to study sex as a biological variable, further expanding the knowledge base of sex effects. Diversity among researchers also helps generate more innovation. Over the years, ORWH has supported critical trans-NIH and extramural research that has profoundly increased our understanding of women's health and produced groundbreaking clinical interventions. Among this work are the Women's Health Initiative, the study of women's health across the nation, and numerous discoveries that have dramatically reduced breast cancer death rates, led to the HPV vaccine, and more recently, contributed to the development of a 3D modeling system of the female reproductive organs tract. The path forward holds great promise. Since 1990, ORWH-supported research, policy innovations, and career programs have helped to expand the knowledge base and produce better science. And by working to broaden the concept of women's health to include all diseases and conditions that affect the health of women from head to toe and across the life course, ORWH is helping to improve the health of women and the families and communities to which they belong.